What's up, guys? Welcome to the third episode of the Medicopolis podcast, where two teenagers discuss medical dilemmas and police them to reach an ultimatum on whether the situation is ethical or not. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen, and we hope you enjoy our episode on the ethics of organ donation. To start off, organ donation is the surgical removal of an organ, tissue, or cells with the intent to give to someone else because of a failure or decrease in organ productivity. There are many different people across the world who want to donate in order to help out. Ashwin, who are these people?
Typically, consent by law is required in order for someone to donate, or there are no reasons to believe that the deceased person would object to the removal of their organ cells or tissues. Essentially, the donor has to be willing. Typically, donors should be genetically, legally, or emotionally related to their recipient, and following the process of informed voluntary consent, professional follow up, and ensured and organized procedure. Selection criteria, essentially meaning that the person that is picked can donate to the recipient, and that it is non coercive, or basically there are no incentives involved. For the people who are minors or legally incompetent, the no cells, tissues, or organs should be removed from those bodies for the purpose of transplantation, other than narrow exceptions. Specific measures should be in place to protect minors, and whenever possible, the minor's assent should be attained before donation. This means that parent or guardian affirmation is not the only thing that is required, but also the minor's assent. Also, as there should be no incentives, sometimes incentive can be received. From the National Organ Transplant Act, or the NOTA, they prohibit the transfer of human organs for valuable consideration, but also remove financial disincentives. But because of shortages that come today, these don't apply anymore, and basic organs have different costs for incentive of donation. So, as much as there should be no monetary value, that is a thing that is now happening in today's world. Again, because of the organ donation shortages that have been happening for the past years. So, Saj, what is the selection process for organ receival after the organ donor has done their donation?
A variety of factors play into organ allocation because there are more than 118,000 people in the US waiting for life saving organ transplants, which include kidney, heart, lung, and liver transplants. A few factors that play into the decision are time already spent on the waiting list, the patient's pediatric status, their survival benefit, and their distance from the hospital that the donor is currently at. There are four different types of organ donation. The first one being an autograft, which is a graft of tissue from one point to another of the same individual's body, and it's typically used for vein extraction and storing blood in advance of surgery. And normally the rejection rates are very low because it's essentially from the same individual to themselves. And there are many places that you can do an autograft, but normally it would be in the tibia, the iliac crest, which is in the pelvic region, and the calvarium, which is the skull. And unfortunately, there are potential drawbacks, which include additional surgical procedures after donation and increased blood loss at the donor site or new site. And it typically takes about 2 to 4 weeks to heal.
Another thing to mention is that autografts typically regenerate faster because of the location of the donor site. Because high amounts of bone matrix proteins found in the iliac crest, pelvis region, and the calvarium, which is around the skull, and mineral collagen allow the bone to develop way faster than if the donor location was from somewhere else, like a different area. Also, the donor site is important because of the strong cortical bones found in those areas, which provide structural support when transplantation is finished. The other more popular type of organ cell or tissue donation is an allograft. An allograft is a transplant of organ, cell, or tissue between two genetically non identical members of the same species. In English terms, that basically means from a human to another human, not from one human to the same human, or not between species. Essentially, human tissue and organ transplants are allografts because a lot of them require the donation of another person, another human, to allow another human to be saved. So, again, this is the most common type of treatment. It's been used for more than 50 years. And it's used for and tissues and cells, typically used for diseases that can lead to failures of organs. In areas like orthopedics, neurosurgery, oncology, and dermatology, they're all used in order to help the patient. Surprisingly, the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration, checks tissues and organs for collection and distribution. So even if it's coming from a random person, like the organ or tissue or cell, and it's not coming from someone they don't know, even if it's from a random person, the FDA will still check for collection and distribution. And over time, tissues from allograft transplants will be used to create newer types that match the recipient's DNA. This is to help avoid rejections for organs, tissues, or cells, which can commonly happen with allograft types because it is not between one person; it is between two people. So this means that infections from allograft tissues can happen. It's one of the major drawbacks. Also, something that can happen is that typical tendon replacements, so things for muscles, have lesser ACL strength, around 30 to 40%. So surgeons tend to have to use grafts or tendons that already exceed 100% ACL strength in the original body, which means sometimes those tendons won't work for the patient because they're too weak for them to be used.
While autografts and allografts are the more common types of transplants, there are also isografts and xenografts. An isograft is a transplant of the tissue from a genetically identical twin donor to another. And the isograft doesn't reject very often since, again, it's from one identical twin to another where they have very similar genetics. However, there are a few drawbacks as well. One of the specific drawbacks being highlighted in an experiment done on young diabetic mice, where the mice had received isografts and the mice were only able to survive approximately 22 days post-transplantation. The point being that the isografts didn't really help too much in the end. Next, for xenograft is a tissue graft or organ transplant from a donor from one species to the recipient being another species. And there are a few drawbacks as well, which Organ Betcher and Eric Holland highlight in their article where they say the main drawback of xenografts is that the genetics and histology of the tumors are frequently not representative of their respective human tumor, essentially meaning that the respective donated parts don't match as well, since, after all, the part is being transferred from one species to another. After the type of transplant has been determined and the organ has been received from the donor, it has to stay properly stored so it can be transferred to the recipient. So, Ashwin, how does this work?
Well, like we already said, organs are checked by the FDA, and after they are checked, they are sent off to mass static cold storage units, where they are all stored before being sent off to the specific hospital where the organ is needed. Individual tissues and organs are treated with special preservation solution so that they stay alive long enough to get to the hospital. At body temperatures, cells pump chemicals in and out of their membranes in order to maintain low concentrations of sodium and high concentrations of potassium within the cells. But when the cells are cold, they can't pump efficiently. So chemicals leak across their membranes, and over time, leaky cells swell up with the excess fluid, sustaining serious damage to the organ, up to the point where it can't even be used by the recipient. So, to prevent this, preservation solutions help delay the damage by keeping sodium and potassium levels in check. They also contain basic nutrients and antioxidants to sustain the cells and subdue inflammation. In combination with ice and a cooler, preservation solutions can keep organs viable for hours after harvest. And organs can typically last in these static cold storage units for a couple days before complete failure in storage. These being the kidneys and the more expendable organs, for lack of a better word. But hearts and lungs have the shortest shelf life of only 4 to 6 hours, and like I already said, kidneys can go from anywhere from 36 to 48 hours.
After the organ has been properly donated, transported, and received, the patient must lie in recovery for typically around 2 to 4 weeks, and sometimes even longer or shorter, depending on the type of transplant that we kind of talked about earlier, or unknown variables that the doctors could potentially face on site. And this kind of concludes the whole cycle on how an organ, tissue, or cell is donated. But unfortunately, there are a few major flaws with this process, like the lack of donated organs. And this leads to one of the biggest problems in today's world, the organ shortage. The demand for organ transplantation has rapidly increased all over the world over the past decade because of more vital organ failures, and there has not been enough organs to help those people that have faced vital organ failures, thus making the demand skyrocket. And there are certain illegal measures that some take to obtain an organ. And unfortunately, this can lead to some results, like exploiting the poor, scams, and homicide, which is a huge problem that we need to face head on. Now, Ashwin and I will head into a few questions that we want to answer and really discuss about organ donation and its ethicality.
Didn't know ethicality was a word, but sure. Okay, let's go through some of these questions. So first off, Saj, how should decisions be made about who receives scarce organs, especially in this day and age of the shortage? How should a decision be made about who receives these organs? Do you think it should be decided by the seriousness of the illness or something else?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a loaded question, right? First of all, I think that the government has really identified some solid factors that really should play a role in this, like waiting time, the patient's compatibility with the specific organ, and their pediatric status. But I think that they've also included some factors that really aren't as necessary, like for example, distance from donor hospital. I think that there should be measures in place to help those that may need it from far away receive these organs because it's really a way of saving lives. And it shouldn't really play into, oh, you get this donor, or sorry, you get this organ because you live closer than this other person. I don't think that's fair.
So, okay, the point you bring up there is that the person who lives closer should receive the organ because they're living, or shouldn't, I guess, in that case. Like, it shouldn't matter on distance, right?
Right, it shouldn't be a factor.
Okay, well then I bring up the fact that organs can't last forever, and especially when distance matters in transportation time, something like an organ lasting for enough time to get to a donor hospital doesn't necessarily only play into the other factors. Distance matters, I guess, in this case, because especially if the transportation of said organ needs to be at a specific temperature with specific guidelines, then we have to make sure that distance is coverable essentially before the organ dies to help the patient as well. So I guess I understand where you're coming from. A lot of these are important, except for a few of the not necessarily as important, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So I think that all of these are pretty important here. I think waiting time especially matters because age and that kind of stuff wouldn't really matter as much if the organ is something like a kidney, because for age, it couldn't matter. Anyone needs at least one kidney to live. So that kind of stuff doesn't matter. But for things like liver and intestines, obviously that is a very horrible thing that a person would need that. And it's obviously affecting their lives a lot. But as the science shows, it's not as easy to live without both kidneys as it is to live with be on, like, for example, I guess life support, for lack of a better word, for some of these other organs. So that's just what I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you kind of have a point there. I just wish that there would be technology that would allow these organs to be transported over long distances. Like, for example, maybe a piece of technology that provides fluids. I remember that we talked about the necessary fluids that the organs need. Maybe a piece of technology that does that. But I guess we can move into the next question. That being, who should pay for transplants? Ashwin, what are your thoughts?
So currently, that is a huge problem, or I guess a financial crisis, you could say, if we're being honest, for some of these payments for the organ donations, because some of these costs for organ receival are kind of outrageous. For something like a heart transplant or an intestine transplant, it can go anywhere from 1 million to 1.5 million dollars for the transplant. So, being honest, that isn't fair to start off. I think that the government should put in place a few services to help pay for these, especially with the ones currently not being as useful. Some of these other organs aren't as expensive, and I feel like for those, it should be more focused on the patient or their family. I guess in that sense, like the family should be more paying for it rather than the patient, because the patient's already the one in that pain. So I guess it depends on two major factors or three major factors. One, Is the organ extremely expensive to do a transplant on, like heart or intestines? Two, is the patient a minor? Because if so, then that automatically goes to the family anyway, the parent or the guardian. And three, if it is a non minor, it could possibly go to other members of the immediate family that could cover the costs, or to extended family that could help pitch in to help pay for it. Because currently, some of these organ transplants are very expensive. Even for the ones that I say aren't as expensive, still are upwards of $400,000, which is crazy in my opinion. Obviously, they're really difficult transplantations, and especially with the technologies we have currently, they're not easy. So some of these costs make sense, but not to the point where I'd see someone paying $1.5 million for a heart transplant. Does that make sense?
Well, I think you kind of have to think about supply and demand here, right? Because if there's like a small supply of something, then the demand is going to skyrocket. And so legal people have to essentially raise their prices really, really high so they're able to meet the demand for their product with the limited supply that they have. So, I mean, yeah, the $1 million upward prices are really outrageous, but unfortunately, it's fitting with how rare it is to receive such a vital organ.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. So basically, the shortage is causing these prices, but yeah, I guess that makes sense. Even without the organ shortage, these prices would probably still be decently high. Obviously, not as high as they are currently. So you bring up a very excellent point there. That should be taken into consideration when dealing with the costs for those kinds of things. The next question that we want to get into for today is, should one person receive several organs, or should several persons receive one? Kind of a heavy hitting question here. Saj, why don't you start?
Well, I think it all depends on the situation of the people that the organs could potentially be distributed amongst. If one person receives several vital organs, then the others on the waiting list might be delayed in their process to receive their organs, which could potentially result in death. But let's say instead you distribute those organs among several people. Then what happens is that one person that needed several organs won't be able to survive. So that organ that they receive, essentially being spent on them, will go to waste. So my point is that it really depends on the situation of each person, how long they have left without their necessary organs, the availability of organs to them, and other factors that the government takes into consideration, since they are the ones in control.
And yeah, you bring up a good point here. When that one person has one organ out of the, say, three or four that they need, they won't be able to survive, and that organ goes to waste. So that is an excellent point you bring up. One thing that I'd also like to talk about is the organ shortage, because again, when a lot of people are on the wait list in a scenario such as this, when there are a lot of people that need organs, even if one person had all three of the necessary organs to live, I feel like it's better to just get everyone off the wait list, because then there's also going to be less need for these organs because more people are receiving them. And especially with the amount of problems that already persist with the costs for organ receival, for the problems with organ donation, like exploitation scams, and other things. I feel like it's important to get as many people off of the waitlist as possible so that these sorts of bad problems can be eliminated up front rather than one person receiving treatment and leaving many people to wait even more. So even though his needs can seem like they far outweigh the needs of everyone else, it really doesn't work like that, especially with the problems that that we already face today with some of these sorts of issues. So as much as it does seem pretty bad to say that one person should just wait for longer, I feel like it is the right choice. Again, that's just my opinion, but that's what I think.
Yeah, I think really, even though you might think that one is greater than the other, I feel like both of them really result in like a grim, unfortunate stalemate.
Yeah, it's a lose lose scenario, kind of like you said. So, the next question is, should one person have a second transplant when the first one fails, or should a different person be given the first chance at a new organ?
Well, I think this is a really sticky question because, like, let's say if someone receives a second transplant, obviously because the first one failed, I think there's always the chance that it rejects again and then another organ is wasted. But it's not fair to say that their life should just go to waste because their body rejected it as well. So I'm kind of a little bit stuck here. But in the end, I kind of lean towards that a different person should be given the first chance at a new organ because at least it gives the other person a chance, and hopefully that the first person that unfortunately it failed with can maybe find another alternative because everyone deserves a chance, and unfortunately, if we spend too much time fixating on one person over another, then it could lead to more problems down the road.
I agree with you. Even though it is kind of the more sad option, I think I can take that same stance as well that multiple people should have multiple chances because, especially because, actually, it's sort of interesting. The statistics on this say 1 out of 10 human hearts transplanted in the US go to patients that have already undergone a transplant that failed. But the problem with this sort of process that happens, or the statistic that keeps occurring, is that retransplanted organs from someone that already had a heart or a liver or a kidney or whatever rejected don't do a very good job of keeping that person alive. Patients who receive a second heart transplant after the first one fails are significantly less likely than patients getting a first transplant to survive for at least a year, as a study found. That held true no matter what their original diagnosis was, which means that someone who receives that second chance might not even get to have the full effect of that second chance because they already had an organ that was rejected. So even through like what the studies show, as much as it is the more sad option, I feel like that's the more correct option, giving more people a second chance because if they hadn't already had some sort of organ transplanted into them, then their chances are statistically going to be higher than someone who has already had a heart transplant. So I feel like that's just the more, again, it's kind of sad and it's not correct. It depends on your opinion, but I think it's just the option that makes more sense in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, obviously we're discussing one versus the other, but I think in many situations there's obviously going to be, or well, not obviously, but there could potentially be a situational alternative that ends up playing into both parties' advantage.
Yeah, exactly. So our next question are: should organs be donated to those persons who have abused their bodies by drinking and smoking, or only to those whose organs are damaged by disease?
Well, I think that really we got to think about what these people have chosen to do, specifically those who have done drinking and smoking, and I think that when they chose to abuse their bodies, I think that they should be given less of a priority, or essentially on the wait list, I think they should be lowered down when comparing them to those that have gotten their organs damaged by disease. Because it's really a case of, oh, this unfortunate thing happened to them, and it's not like they brought it upon themselves.
Yeah, I think what you said makes a lot of sense here. There's not much else to bring up. I think I sort of agree with what you're saying as well. People who abuse their bodies by drinking and smoking have made the conscious choice to do that. So by saying that they should have the same chances as people whose organs are damaged by disease, obviously they everyone deserves a chance, but by making the conscious decision to choose that kind of harm to your own body, it doesn't make sense that they should have a better chance than someone who had unlikely circumstances and therefore needed an organ to live, essentially. So I feel like that should be just dependent on the choices that the patient makes, which again is something that is actually used in the waitlist when figuring out factors in organ allocation. So these are some of the problems that a patient can face when being on the waitlist.
But really quickly, I have a hypothetical here. Playing devil's advocate. What if that person that abused their body in the past, let's say that they quit smoking or drinking 10 years ago? Ashwin, how would your opinion on this kind of situation change?
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. I feel like, hmm, in this in the scenario where the person, so you're saying they have made the conscious decision now to stop abusing their bodies with those kinds of substances. What do I think? How do I think the question stands now? Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, like a long time ago, they ended up choosing to stop doing it, and now unfortunately they're facing the repercussions, but they really tried to better their lives afterward. So what do you think about that?
Okay. I think in that case, the person who made the conscious decision to stop also still did make the conscious decision to start. So even though they have now decided to stop and now are facing the repercussions for their actions, or consequences for their actions, sorry, still have to face it no matter how long, how much time has passed. So I feel like they should still be lower on the wait list because they still did make those decisions at one point in their lives. And even though they don't agree with that decision anymore, they have to face the facts that they still did.
I agree. And then for our last question. Should a person's family be able to make the decision that a deceased loved one's organs should be donated?
So I feel like a person's family should be able to make that decision for the person who died because the family knows that person best. So if the person didn't end up making the choice while they were alive, but the family knew them as someone who wouldn't mind making that decision for them, then I feel like in that case it's all right. The family would probably know the decision that the person would want to make because they're that's the people that that person has spent the most time with. So being able to make that decision should be on the family, in my opinion. I feel like, especially with our organ shortage, any sort of organs that a person would like to donate and just never got around to doing so, a family should be able to help with this, I guess, sort of organ shortage crisis we're going through by letting someone posthumously donate their organs even when a problem is happening.
Yeah, I think that you covered the correct points here. I think that the family knows the person's values and what they would have wanted, even though they aren't able to communicate it at the current time. So, yeah, I think that the family should be able to make that decision.
I think that covers all bases for organ donation and their ethics behind it. And that was our third episode. So thank you guys so much for listening to the Medicopolis podcast. We hope you all stay tuned for next week's episode and as well as what is to come in the future.